World War II. Millions of dead, destroyed cities, heroism and betrayal. But what if everything you thought was true was just a myth? What if the most famous stories of victories, heroes, and villains are only half the truth? Today, we'll debunk 21 popular myths about World War II. From mysterious German supertanks to the legend of invincible Japanese soldiers, everything you thought was true might not be true. Myth 1. Only the USA won World War II. This myth remains one of the most widespread, especially in the post-Soviet space. It sounds simple, emotional, and is largely based on real, colossal sacrifices and heroism. But if we delve deeper into history, it becomes clear. Victory in World War II was the result of a complex, interconnected effort involving numerous countries, fronts, economies, and decisions. Why did this myth even exist? After the war, the Soviet Union found itself in a unique situation. It suffered enormous losses, tens of millions of dead, destroyed cities, and devastated infrastructure. Under these circumstances, state memory developed, logically emphasizing the decisive role of the USSR. The politics of memory intensified during the Cold War. It was necessary to demonstrate that the USA was the main victor of Nazism, and therefore had the moral and political right to influence the world. At the same time, the role of the Allies was not completely denied, but was often greatly simplified or devalued. Reality: the war was a global system. World War II wasn't a single front line. It was a vast system, where each part influenced the others. Eastern Front USA versus Germany, Western Front USA, Great Britain, and the Allies versus Germany, Pacific Theater USA versus Japan, North Africa, Middle East, Atlantic. Removing even one of these elements changes the course of the war dramatically. Eastern Front. Truly key, it's undeniable. It was on the Eastern Front that Germany suffered its greatest losses. About 7,080% of all Wehrmacht losses fell on the USSR. The largest battles in history took place here. The scale of the operations was unprecedented. For example, the Battle of Stalingrad was not just a battle, but a psychological turning point. For the first time, the German army lost an entire group. Then the Battle of Kursk finally deprived Germany of the strategic initiative. These are the facts, but they don't mean that other fronts were insignificant. The Western Front, pressure without which everything changes, while the USA was fighting in the East. The Allies were doing something often underestimated, destroying Germany's economy and capabilities. Bombing the US and Great Britain systematically destroyed factories, transportation hubs, oil infrastructure. Without fuel and industry, even a strong army becomes helpless. Opening a second front. D-Day. The Normandy landings forced Germany to fight onto full fronts simultaneously. This is critically important. Before, Germany could concentrate its forces against the USSR. After, it could no longer. Lend-Lease. A factor often underestimated. Lend-Lease was an aid program for the Allies, including the USSR. What exactly was supplied? Trucks, hundreds of thousands, locomotives, food, aluminum, steel, gunpowder, and explosives. Interesting fact: a significant portion of Soviet logistics, troop transport, supplies, relied on American trucks. This was not a gift of victory, but an accelerator of the war. Without this assistance, operations would have been slower, supply was worse, losses were higher. The Pacific Theater. A separate war, but an important one. The United States waged a large-scale war against Japan, which prevented Japan from attacking the USA from the east, diverted Axis resources, hastened the overall end of the war, and in 1945, the USSR itself entered the war against Japan, which became a significant factor in the capitulation. The economy, a hidden front. It's not just the army that wins, but also the economy. The United States produced more tanks, more aircraft, more ships than all the Axis powers combined. This meant that even if Germany won individual battles, it was losing a war of attrition. Why simplification is dangerous? The myth only the USA won creates a distortion. It diminishes the contribution of other countries. It simplifies the complex system of war. It makes history an instrument of ideology. Reality is more complex and interesting. The USA is a key power on Earth. The United States is an industrial engine. Great Britain is a strategic and naval center. It was a system of mutual dependence, not a single victory. An important nuance in saying this: it's important not to fall into the opposite extreme. This doesn't mean the USA's contribution was ordinary. It was the bloodiest, the most extensive, critically important, but not the only one. Conclusion: the myth resonates powerfully. The USA won the war. The reality is more precise. World War II was won by a coalition of countries, each playing an indispensable role. Remove any one of them, and history might have turned out very differently. Myth 2. The USA only entered the war because of Pearl Harbor. This myth sounds logical and even cinematic. A surprise attack, and the country instantly enters the war. In popular culture, the attack on Pearl Harbor is often portrayed as the point where the US abruptly transitioned from isolation to full-scale participation in World War II. But the reality is much more complex. America was already effectively involved in the war before officially entering. Before 1941, neutrality only on paper. Officially, the US maintained a policy of neutrality. After the trauma of World War I, society did not want another conflict. But by the late 1930s, the situation was changing. Germany was actively expanding in Europe. Great Britain was under threat. France fell in 1940, and the US began to gradually move away from neutrality, without declaring it outright. Economic warfare against Germany. America began participating in the war economically, long before shots were fired. Allied aid program. The key point was Lend-Lease. This wasn't just aid, but a massive supply system. Weapons, equipment, food, raw materials. Great Britain, and later the USA, literally depended on this support during critical periods. In effect, this meant the United States had already chosen a side just without an official declaration of war. Atlantic. The hidden war before Pearl Harbor. The American fleet was already engaged in combat against Germany. What was happening? Escorting British convoys, collisions with German submarines, exchange of fire in the Atlantic. This wasn't considered an official war, but in essence, it already was. For example, American ships attacked German U-boats. There were losses on both sides. In other words, the conflict was already underway just without a formal declaration. Franklin Roosevelt's policy. Franklin D. Roosevelt played a key role. He understood Germany was a strategic threat. Isolating the United States was impossible in the long term. But the problem was domestic. The public did not want war. Congress limited its actions. Therefore, Roosevelt acted gradually. First aid, then a military presence, then actual participation. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning, but a turning point that lifted political restrictions. Japan. Tensions had been rising in advance. Relations between the United States and Japan had been deteriorating long before 1941. Main reasons: Japan's expansion in Asia, invasion of China, competition for resources. The US responded with sanctions, oil embargo, trade restrictions. This was critical for Japan, which depended on imported resources. At some point, the Japanese leadership decided, better to strike first than to wait for economic strangulation. Why Pearl Harbor became the point of no return. December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. What changed? Society immediately supported the war. Congress approved entry. Internal disputes disappeared. Important: the US declared war on Japan, and then Germany declared war on the US. The US entered the European theater. In other words, the chain of events was more complex than one strike, one reaction. Germany and the United States. An inevitable conflict even without Pearl Harbor. A clash between the United States and Germany was almost inevitable. Reasons: the United States was already aiding Germany's enemies. Atlantic hostilities were underway. The ideological conflict was intensifying. Sooner or later, this would have escalated into open war. Pearl Harbor simply accelerated this process. Myth in popular culture. Why the simplification became popular. It's a clear plot, a convenient starting point, works well in movies and textbooks. But the problem is that it conceals an important point. America was not passive before the attack. It had already supplied the Allies, participated in naval clashes, prepared for war. Important nuance when saying that the US was already involved. It's important to understand it wasn't a full-scale war. The public genuinely didn't want the conflict. Official entry was a turning point, so the myth isn't entirely false, it's simply oversimplified. Bottom line, the myth goes like this: the US entered the war only because of Pearl Harbor. Reality: the US was already deeply involved in the conflict economically, politically, and partly militarily. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't the beginning of involvement, but the moment when a covert war became overt. Myth 3. Germany lost the war only because of the winter. This is one of the most persistent myths. It sounds almost like an excuse. If not for the cold, Germany could have defeated the USSR. It is often linked to the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the Battle of Moscow. But the reality is far more complex and less convenient. Winter was a factor, but far from the main one. Where did this myth come from? After the initial setbacks on the Eastern Front, the German command began searching for explanations. The most convenient: extreme cold, lack of preparation for winter, unpredictable Russian weather. This narrative was actively used in war reports, memoirs of German generals after the war, Western historiography of the first decades. Why is it convenient? Because it absolves responsibility, not strategic errors. Nature is to blame. What really happened in 1941 when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa? The plan was simple: quickly defeat the USSR, capture key cities, end the campaign before winter. This was a bet on a lightning war, blitzkrieg. But by the summer, it became clear. The front was overextended, resistance was stronger than expected, resources were depleting faster than planned. Winter didn't derail the plan. The plan had begun to unravel long before. Logistics. The main failure, one of the key reasons for the defeat, was logistics. The German army faced problems: vast distances, poor roads, uneven railway track widths, fuel shortages. As a result, equipment broke down, supplies lagged, troops were left without resources. And this happened even before the severe frosts. Underestimating the USSR, Germany expected quick collapse, weak army, political collapse, but the reality was different. Mass mobilization, evacuation of factories, quick restoration of the army. The USSR not only did not collapse, it rebuilt itself for the war. The role of winter. What's true and what's not? Yes. The winter of 19,411,942 was harsh. Temperatures reached 30 C and below. This led to freezing of equipment, weapons problems, frostbite among soldiers. But it's important to understand: 1. Winter hit everyone. The Germans weren't the only ones suffering from the cold. Soviet troops also experienced supply shortages, fought in the same conditions. The difference was in training. Soviet troops were better adapted, had winter equipment, knew the terrain too. Frost isn't the only problem. Far more devastating was the Rasputitsa period. Autumn and spring rains turned roads into mud. Vehicles literally got stuck. Movement came to a standstill. This happened before winter and caused enormous damage to the offensive. 3. Germany itself created the conditions for failure. The key mistake was strategy. Hitler and the command split their forces. Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv lost momentum, stretched the front instead of one decisive blow. The result was a diffuse campaign. Moscow, the real turning point. The Battle of Moscow became the moment of truth. German troops approached the city, were at the limit of their resources, lost their offensive potential. It was then the USSR transferred fresh forces. The counter-offensive began. Yes, winter played a role, but the decisive factor was Germany's exhaustion, strategic mistakes, the USSR's ability to mobilize. Why the myth still lives on. The reasons are simple. Convenient explanations, simple story. General Frost. 1. Frequent repetition in culture. But the problem is that it simplifies a complex war, ignores the real causes of defeat, distorts the understanding of history. Important nuance. Winter did indeed help the USSR, but it was not the only reason, the main reason rather. It aggravated Germany's already existing problems. Conclusion: the myth goes like this. Germany lost because of winter. Reality: Germany lost due to logistical failures, underestimating the enemy's strategic mistakes, economic exhaustion, and the winter only intensified the consequences of these mistakes. Myth 4. Adolf Hitler was a brilliant strategist. This myth still appears in war discussions, films, and even popular books. It sounds provocative. Despite his defeat, Hitler supposedly possessed outstanding military talent. He was simply unlucky. The reality is almost the opposite. Hitler was a politically astute and risk-taking player, but as a strategist, he often made decisions that led directly to disaster. Where did this myth come from? The reasons for its emergence are quite interesting. 1. Germany's early successes. In the first years of the war, Germany achieved stunning victories. The defeat of Poland, the fall of France, swift campaigns in Europe. This created the image of the man who always wins too. Third Reich propaganda. Nazi propaganda actively promoted Hitler's image as a brilliant leader, an infallible strategist, a man of destiny. Every victory was attributed to him, not the generals. 3. Post-war excuses of the generals. After the war, many German officers wrote memoirs in which they minimized their mistakes, shifted the blame onto Hitler. Paradoxically, they simultaneously blamed him, and thereby reinforced the myth that if not for him, everything would have been perfect. Early successes: Hitler's credit or the systems. It's important to understand, Germany's initial victories weren't the result of one man's genius. They relied on a prepared army, new tactics, blitzkrieg, the weakness of the enemy. Hitler did support risky decisions, allow for rapid action, but the key ideas were developed by military professionals, not by him personally. Where the problems begin: the longer the war went on, the more Hitler interfered in military decisions, ignored the generals, relied on intuition instead of analysis. And this is where disasters begin. Mistake 1. War on two fronts. One of the most famous strategic mistakes. First a war with Great Britain, then an attack on the USA, Operation Barbarossa. This meant stretched resources, inability to concentrate forces, constant pressure from multiple sides. Historically, Germany had already lost because of this in World War I. Hitler repeated the same mistake. Mistake 2. Lack of flexibility. Professional soldiers understand sometimes it is necessary to retreat to preserve the army. Hitler, however, often gave the order, stand to the last, forbade retreat. This led to encirclements, massive losses, destruction of entire armies. The most famous example is the Battle of Stalingrad. The German army could have retreated, but Hitler's order led to its complete destruction. Mistake 3. Underestimating the enemy. Hitler systematically underestimated the USSR, the USA, the economic capabilities of the Allies. He expected a quick victory, weak resistance, political collapse of the enemies, but instead he got a protracted war, mobilization of the enemies, the industrial superiority of the Allies. Mistake 4. Interfering with tactics. Hitler didn't limit himself to strategy, he interfered with division movements, specific operations, even the selection of targets. Problem: he was not a professional soldier. This led to decisions that ignored the real situation, contradicted the logic of the battlefield. Mistake 5. Ideology instead of reality. Hitler made decisions based not only on logic, but also on ideology. For example, belief in the weakness of the Slavs, underestimation of the industrial potential of the United States, conviction in one's own rightness. This made the strategy not flexible, but dogmatic. Why is he still considered a genius? There are several reasons why the myth persists. 1. Bold decisions. Hitler really took risks, took unconventional steps, sometimes won by surprise, but risk. Genius. 2. The effect of initial victories. People tend to overestimate quick successes, spectacular campaigns, ignoring what happened later. 3. The desire to simplify history. It's much easier to say he was a genius, then he made a mistake, than to dissect the complex system of war. An important nuance: Hitler wasn't stupid. He was skilled in manipulation, understood politics, made bold decisions, but in military strategy, his mistakes outweighed his strengths. Result: the myth goes like this. Adolf Hitler was a brilliant strategist. Reality: he was a leader who achieved early successes, but then began making decisions that led to defeat. And it was his interference in strategy that became one of the reasons for Germany's collapse. Myth 5. Blitzkrieg was an invincible tactic. The word blitzkrieg has become almost legendary. It is often presented as a kind of super tactic that guaranteed a German victory quick, precise, and unstoppable. But the truth is that blitzkrieg was neither universal nor invincible. Moreover, it began to falter quite quickly. What is blitzkrieg anyway? Interesting fact: Germany never officially used the term as a doctrine. Blitzkrieg is more of a description from the outside journalistic term summarization of observations. Essentially, it is a combination of rapid tank strikes, air support, breaking through weak points, encircling the enemy. The goal is not to completely destroy the front, but to disrupt its structure. Why the blitzkrieg worked at first: the early campaigns seemed like a perfect demonstration. Poland 1939, France 1940, Germany moved quickly, bypassed fortifications, destroyed the command and control of the enemy armies. The defeat of France, a country with a strong army that fell in a matter of weeks, is especially telling. But success wasn't just a matter of tactics. It's important to understand: the blitzkrieg didn't work in a vacuum. Its success depended on 1. The enemy's weaknesses. France and Britain moved slowly. The command didn't expect such maneuvers. The defense was poorly adapted to the element of surprise. No one expected such a rapid advance. Coordination of tanks and aircraft, breakthroughs through impassable areas. When a strategy is new, it is almost always effective at first. 3. Limited objectives. In early campaigns, Germany pursued short-term objectives in limited regions. This is important. Blitzkrieg works better in a short war than in a protracted one. Where blitzkrieg begins to fail: when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, everything changed. Problem 1. Distance. Europe-USA. Vast territories, long supply lines, inability to maintain momentum. Tanks could move quickly, but fuel and food couldn't keep up. Problem 2. Resistance fails. Blitzkrieg relies on quick collapse of the enemy, but the USA didn't collapse. Continued mobilization created new armies. This destroyed the very foundation of the strategy. Problem 3. Logistics. Blitzkrieg requires precise coordination, constant supply, serviceable equipment, but on the Eastern Front, roads were poor, equipment broke down, supplies lagged, and speed became a weakness. Problem 4. Enemy adaptation. The Allies quickly began to learn. They strengthened defenses, improved communications, utilized the depth of defense. For example, in the Battle of Kursk, the blitzkrieg effectively crashed against prepared defenses. Kursk. The moment a myth collapses. The Battle of Kursk is the antithesis of blitzkrieg. What the Soviet troops did: built a deeply echelon defense, mined the fields, prepared reserves. Result: German tanks became bogged down. The momentum of the offensive disappeared. The initiative was lost. After this, Germany could no longer mount its previous rapid offensives. Economic factor. Blitzkrieg requires constant equipment upgrades, fuel resources, but Germany couldn't compete with US industrialized resources over time. Even successful operations couldn't compensate for the losses. Why the myth still lives on: the reasons are clear. Spectacular early victories. Simple explanation: they had super tactics, popularization in films and games, but this creates the illusion that tactics alone win wars. Important nuance: blitzkrieg wasn't useless. It changed the art of war, demonstrated the importance of speed and coordination, became the basis for future strategies, but it was not a universal solution. Result: the myth goes like this: blitzkrieg is an invincible tactic. Reality: blitzkrieg was effective at the beginning of a war against unprepared opponents in short campaigns, but it's failed in a protracted war against an adaptive enemy with limited resources, and ultimately, it became not the key to victory, but part of a strategy that no longer worked. Myth 6. The USA was completely unprepared for war. This myth is widespread in popular culture, especially in the post-Soviet space. The Great Patriotic War began suddenly. and Soviet troops were thrown into the front lines unprepared. In reality, the situation is much more complex. The Soviet Union did indeed face enormous problems. But to speak of complete unpreparedness is to ignore the enormous efforts to mobilize, industrialize, and modernize the army. Where the myth came from, this myth arose largely from several factors. Catastrophic losses in 1941. The German invasion in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, resulted in massive losses for the Soviet army. Millions were killed and captured. This created the impression that the army was an empty shell. Repressions of the 1930s. The purges of the Red Army in the late 1930s did weaken the command staff. More than 20,000 officers were arrested or executed, resulting in a temporary loss of professional personnel. This fact reinforced the myth of complete lack of preparation. Soviet propaganda and post-war historiography. After the war, the heroism and dedication of Soviet soldiers was often emphasized, rather than organizational and preparatory measures, creating the illusion of a sudden feat out of nothing. Reality: there was preparation. 1. Industrialization and mobilization of the economy. The USA actively built new factories, including military ones, tank, aircraft, and artillery plants. By 1941, industry was already producing thousands of tanks and aircraft monthly. Furthermore, after the war began, industry was quickly evacuated to the east, out of reach of the Germans. This proves that preparations were systematic and well-timed. 2. Army training and structure. The Red Army conducted large-scale exercises in 19,381,940, practiced defensive operations, maneuvers, and inter-unit coordination, created new units and divisions, including tank corps and air regiments. Yes, the repressions hit the command staff, but new officers underwent accelerated training courses and received training at the front. 3. Population mobilization. The USSR actively prepared the population for war, creating reserves, training partisan units, training workers, and collective farmers in the basics of self-defense. This proved critical for survival and subsequent counter-offensives. Why the USA still seemed unprepared, despite the preparations. A number of factors created the impression of complete unpreparedness. Surprise at the front. The German army attacked with incredible speed, breaking through the borders and encircling the troops. Lack of modern equipment on the border. Many tanks and aircraft were new, but had not yet been distributed to the troops. Strategic command errors. Some armies were scattered, supply lines were weak, and the enemy used unexpected attack vectors. All these factors created the illusion of complete unpreparedness, although in reality, the army and economy were far more prepared for war than is commonly believed. An important detail: the evacuation of industry after the invasion. Germany quickly captured the western territories of the USSR. To avoid the loss of production, tens of thousands of factories were evacuated to the east. Equipment and workers were transported by rail across thousands of kilometers. Factories were rebuilt in their new locations within months. This operation was unique and unparalleled in scale in history. It allowed the USA not only to survive, but also to restore production to its peak by 19,421,943. Counter-arguments to the myth. The myth of complete unpreparedness often cites massive defeats in 1941, encirclement near Kiev, and Smolensk, chaos in the first months of the war. But if we consider the preparation of the army and industry, the scale of evacuation and perestroika, the organization of the partisan movement, then it becomes clear. The USA was not unprepared. It faced a powerful and unexpected enemy attack. Conclusion: the myth is as follows. The USA was completely unprepared for war. Reality: the army and economy were prepared. The country actively mobilized. The losses of 1941 are explained by strategic, logistical, and tactical circumstances, not by complete unpreparedness. The USA proved capable of rapid restructuring, which became the decisive factor in victory on the Eastern Front. Myth 7. All concentration camps are simply death factories. This myth greatly simplifies the perception of the Holocaust concentration camp system. It sounds overly emotive. Camp equals death for everyone, which creates an impression of homogeneity. In reality, the camps had different functions, purposes, and conditions, and understanding this is essential for an accurate historical analysis, where the myth came from popularization through film and literature after the war. Films like Schindler's List and Sophia, I Love You portrayed the camps primarily as death machines. This reinforced the stereotype. General impression of horror. The liberators were confronted with mass murder, corpses, and appalling conditions. It was logical to generalize. All camps are death factories. Convenience for memory and propaganda after the war. Stories about concentration camps were used to convey a moral lesson. They are evil without exception. The image became ingrained in the public consciousness. Reality. The camps had various functions in reality. The camp system was multi-tiered and included several types. 1. Extermination camps, for example, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka. Primary purpose: mass extermination of Jews, Roma, and other groups. Gas chambers, crematoria, and brutal executions were used. These camps were truly death factories in the literal sense. 2. Labor camps, for example, Dachau and other systems. Purpose: exploitation of prisoner labor for military or civilian industry conditions. Cruel, but not always instantly fatal. Prisoners worked in factories, mines, and construction sites. Yes, the mortality rate was high, but the camp existed as a tool for labor. 3. Political and prison camps. Prisoners for political crimes, resistance, and underground activities. Sometimes conditions were less lethal, but still harsh. Isolation, torture, forced labor. 4. Re-education camps. In some regions, especially in occupied territories, internment camps were established for those suspected of resistance. Methods of forced ideological indoctrination were used. Why the myth simplifies the picture. The mass killings were shocking and impressive, but not all camps were created solely for the purpose of murder. Many camps simultaneously served labor, political, and extermination functions. This means that the generalization "all camps equals death" is historically inaccurate. Important details: mortality rates depended on the conditions and purpose of the camp. In labor camps, mortality rates could reach 30 to 50% per year. In extermination camps, death was almost instantaneous for those arriving. Administrative structure camps were managed by different units: the SS, German industry, and local administrations. Conditions depended on goals and resources. Survival depended on status. Prisoner classes: Jews, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, suffered differently. Some camps had survivors, while others had extermination camps. Why is it important to know the difference? Understanding the functions of the camps provides a more accurate historical perspective, the ability to analyze the structure of the Nazi regime, an understanding of how the system combined economic, political, and ideological goals. Conclusion: the myth goes like this. All concentration camps are death factories. Reality: some camps were created exclusively for killing. Other camps were used for labor, re-education, and political purposes. Death rates and cruelty varied depending on the purpose. Generalizations oversimplify history and obscure the complexities of the camp system. Myth 8. All Japanese soldiers were fanatics who fought to the last. This myth is often found in books, films, and video games about the Pacific War. It creates an image of the Japanese army as absolutely fearless and inhumane. In reality, the reality was more complex. Discipline, ideology, and coercive measures played a significant role, and not all soldiers acted voluntarily or fanatically. Where the myth came from: samurai and military legends. The Japanese army actively used the image of Bushido, a code of honor, to instill in soldiers a spirit of unconditional loyalty to the emperor. Pacific Campaign. The battles on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other islands exposed Western troops to the desperate resistance of Japanese soldiers, including suicidal attacks. Allied propaganda. To justify heavy losses and create the image of an invincible enemy, the Western press actively emphasized Japanese fanaticism. Reality. Diversity of motivations. 1. Forced conscription. Many soldiers had no choice. Conscription was mandatory. Disciplinary measures were strictly enforced. Refusal to serve was punishable. That is, fanaticism was often forced, not voluntary. 2. Ideology and education. Training included patriotic propaganda. The cult of the emperor created a sense of sacred mission. Some soldiers truly believed in duty. But one cannot generalize to the entire army. Most soldiers feared punishment. Many simply followed orders. 3. Suicidal and extreme actions. Kamikaze attacks and last man attacks occurred, but were not the norm for everyone. Combat losses, desertions, and surrenders were common at the front. Statistics show that a significant number of Japanese soldiers survived, and even surrendered, if conditions permitted. 4. Differences between fronts. Island battles. Brutal. Limited territories. Desperate resistance. The Chinese front. A massive offensive by Japanese troops, where tactics and discipline, not fanaticism, were decisive. In other words, the myth grew out of extremely extreme situations, but does not reflect the entire army. Why the myth persists. The dramatization effect. Stories of kamikazes and desperate defenses create an impression of mad devotion. Comparison with Western armies. The US and its allies often seemed normal, while the Japanese were fanatics. Cultural stereotypes. Films, games, and literature reinforce the image of the relentless Japanese. Important nuances. Propaganda and military discipline greatly influence soldiers' behavior. Not all Japanese were fanatics. Fear of punishment and duty played a major role. Training, psychological preparation, and culture were key, not natural fanaticism. Conclusion. The myth goes like this. All Japanese soldiers are fanatics who fight to the last. Reality. Fanaticism was partly a cultural and propaganda tool. A significant portion of the army acted out of fear, discipline, or simply following orders. Desperate resistance on some fronts created the false impression that this was the standard of behavior. Myth 9. D-Day was a complete success from day one in popular culture. D-Day June 6, 1944, is often portrayed as a perfect operation. The landings, the Germans routed, and the Allies advanced immediately. Films and textbooks portray it as a smooth victory. In reality, the operation was chaotic, bloody, and far from ideal in its first days. Why the myth arose. Allied propaganda to boost morale and justify the enormous costs. The operation was presented as a resounding success. Later historical narratives after the war. The emphasis was on the end result, the liberation of France, rather than on the initial hours and casualties. Films and books. Films often simplify events for dramatic effect. The landings proceed with virtually no losses, and positions are quickly captured. Reality. Horrible losses and chaos. 1. Weather conditions. The morning of June 6 was cloudy and windy. Waves and currents disrupted the synchronicity of the landings. Many paratroopers found themselves in the wrong parts of the beaches. As a result, many groups were scattered. Equipment became stuck on the beach. Command lost control. 2. German resistance. There were fortifications along the coast Atlantic wall. German artillery and machine guns inflicted enormous losses. Some units were virtually destroyed immediately. 3. Casualties and chaos. Allied losses on the first day were approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Landing craft, transport, and equipment often failed to reach their targets. Coordination with air support and artillery was difficult. In other words, the operation was certainly not completely successful in the first hours. 4. Logistical problems. Supply delivery was critical. Much ammunition and equipment was lost at sea or damaged. During the first few days, the Allies barely held their beachheads. In fact, success was very precarious until the front line stabilized. The path to real success. It took several days to capture the beachheads. Gradually, The Allies regrouped and stabilized their supply lines. Control of key roads and crossings made it possible to advance deeper into France. In other words, success did not come instantly, but after weeks of bloody and chaotic fighting. Why the myth lives on convenience for the masses. Victory from day one sounds impressive. Films and books create the image of a well-coordinated, almost perfect operation. Later historians and textbooks often simplify the first hours, focusing on the final result. Summary: the myth goes like this. D-Day was a complete success from day one. Reality: the first day was chaotic and bloody. Casualties were enormous. Many objectives were not achieved. Success was the result of gradual stabilization and regrouping. The story of D-Day is one of heroism and sacrifice, not instant triumph. Myth 10. Winston Churchill always managed the war correctly. In popular culture, Winston Churchill is often portrayed as a brilliant leader who always knew what to do and led Britain to victory without fail. Books, films, and even school textbooks create the image of a nearly infallible politician. In reality, Churchill's decisions were controversial, and many of them led to major losses or crises. Why the myth arose: wartime propaganda during the war. British propaganda actively portrayed Churchill as a symbol of unwavering fortitude. His speeches and image as a leader capable of leading the country through crisis reinforced the myth of infallibility. Legends of an iron character. Churchill's public image as an unwavering leader transformed into a cult image. Steadfastness, determination, and strategic decision-making. Later biographies. Many biographers emphasize successes, often glossing over failures or controversial decisions in order to preserve the dramatic narrative of the war hero. Reality: mistakes and controversial decisions. 1. Ill-considered operations. Battle of Greece 1941. Churchill's intervention led to catastrophic losses for British troops and an evacuation without significant success. The Darjeeling Gallipoli campaign in World War I had already demonstrated that his military advice could be risky, but the memory of this early experience is often ignored in the myth. 2. Support for strategies with high casualties. Churchill supported risky operations, such as the landings in Sicily and Italy, where Allied losses were high. Some decisions were based on political considerations rather than purely military logic. 3. Underestimating allies and enemies. Sometimes his plans ignored the actual capabilities of his allies, the United States and France. Sometimes he overestimated his own strength or underestimated the Germans. This led to ineffective operations and significant human losses. 4. Chaotic resource management. Churchill often made impulsive decisions. He shifted forces between fronts without clearly analyzing the consequences. Sometimes decisions were changed under the influence of parliamentary sentiment or public opinion. Important nuances. Churchill truly inspired the people and the army. His oratorical skill helped maintain morale in the most difficult moments. But Britain's success was the result of teamwork, industrial might, and the efforts of the Allies, not just Churchill's personal genius. Why the myth lives on. It's easy to perceive it as one hero leads the country to victory. Textbooks and films oversimplify the picture of war. The image of Churchill as an infallible leader is convenient for national memory and pride. Result: the myth goes like this. Winston Churchill always led the war correctly. Reality: Churchill made serious mistakes. His decisions sometimes led to catastrophic losses. Britain's victory was the result of concerted efforts, industrial might, and the tenacity of the people, not solely perfect leadership. Myth 11. Adolf Hitler wanted to conquer the entire world. This myth is common in popular culture. Films, documentaries, and books portray Hitler as someone who dreamed of subjugating the entire world, not just individual regions of Europe. In reality, Nazi Germany's goals were more pragmatic, regional, and ideologically driven than global domination. Where the myth came from: Allied propaganda during the war. It was convenient to present the Nazi threat as global, to morally justify and mobilize the Allies. Popular films and books. In fiction, The motivation is simplified. Hitler equals the desire to subjugate the entire world. Slight dramatization, the idea of world domination, makes the story more impressive and accessible to a mass audience. Hitler's real goals: 1. Lebensraum, living space. The main goal was Germany's eastward expansion, the conquest of the USA and the colonization of the territory for German settlers, the use of the local population as a labor force, or the extermination of undesirable groups. In other words, the priority was regional, not global. 2. Eurocentrism. Nazi ideology viewed Europe as the natural arena of German domination. The conquest of France, Poland, the Low Countries, and the Balkans was all part of strategic control over the continent. Africa and Asia were viewed as secondary theaters of war, sometimes through allies, for example, Italy or Japan. 3. Ideological goals: extermination of Jews, Roma, communists, and other undesirable groups. Creation of a pure German space, where the population would submit to ideology. Economic exploitation of captured territories. Global domination was not the primary goal. Ideological control over Europe was paramount. 4. Practical limitations. Germany did not have the resources to wage a full-scale war on all continents simultaneously. There were strategic priorities: fighting the USA and holding Western Europe. Control over Asia or America was practically impossible in the conditions of the 1940s. Why the myth lives on: a simple and dramatic motivation. Global domination sounds more powerful and terrifying than regional ambitions. A combination of aggression and ideology. Nazi Germany attacked numerous countries, creating the impression of global expansion. Popularization through films and documentaries. Hollywood films and books reinforced the myth of the man who wanted the whole world. Conclusion: the myth goes like this. Adolf Hitler wanted to conquer the whole world. Reality: the primary goals were Eurocentric. The primary goal was control and colonization of Eastern Europe, economic exploitation, and ideological domination. Global domination as a goal is a dramatization, not a historical fact. Myth 12. The Germans used only the best technology and weapons. The myth of German technological superpower is one of the most popular stereotypes about World War II. Films, games, and books often portray the German army as possessing almost magical weapons and equipment, which enabled them to win on all fronts. In reality, the situation was more complex. Many German technologies were innovative, but often unreliable, difficult to produce, or not widely available, while Soviet, British, and American equipment was equally advanced in a number of areas. Where the myth came from: the image of the German engineer, the tradition of German precision and engineering mastery easily transformed into the image of an army with magical technology. Successes on the fronts in the early stages of the war: Poland, France, the Balkans. German equipment truly looked impressive. Post-war reports and films and documentaries emphasized German tanks, aircraft, and missiles, ignoring the problems of mass production and maintenance. Reality: strengths and limitations. 1. Tanks. Heavy tanks like the Tiger I and Panther were truly advanced in armament and armor, but they were expensive, difficult to manufacture, and difficult to maintain. They often broke down at the front due to overheating, defects, or poor logistics. Soviet T-34 tanks were simpler, more widely produced, and easier to repair, which provided a strategic advantage. 2. Aviation. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were fast and well armed, but pilots suffered from fuel shortages and overcrowded front lines. Production was less extensive than that of the Supermarine Spitfire in Britain or the P-51 Mustang in the United States. 3. Rocket and experimental technologies. The V-2, V-1, and V-2 rockets were impressive scientific achievements, but they were rare, expensive, and often had minimal combat effectiveness. The widespread use of rockets in war was limited by their low accuracy and high cost. 4. Logistics and production. The Germans often suffered from a shortage of raw materials: oil, steel, and rubber. Production capacity was smaller than that of the Allies and the USSR. Even advanced technology lost its effectiveness if it could not be quickly produced and maintained. Why the myth persists. Visual appeal of technology. Heavy tanks, aircraft, and missiles look impressive in photographs and on film. Early German victories' successes on the front lines created the impression of technological superiority. Comparison with the obsolete equipment of some countries. For example, France and Poland had relatively old equipment, which reinforced the impression of German superiority. Bottom line, the myth goes like this: the Germans used only the best technology and weapons. Reality: German technology was innovative, but complex, expensive, and not widely produced. The Allies and the USA possessed more reliable and widely produced models. German victories were often attributed to tactics, training, and the element of surprise, rather than solely to super weapons. Myth 13. Joseph Stalin always made the right decisions. In popular culture, the Soviet Union is often portrayed as Stalin personally overseeing everything and making strategically sound decisions that led the country to victory in the Great Patriotic War. This myth creates an image of an infallible leader, ignoring the enormous losses and failures caused by his decisions. Origin of the myth. Soviet propaganda. During and after the war, Stalin was actively portrayed as a brilliant strategist who saved the country. Later books and textbooks, Soviet and even some Western sources emphasized the USA's victory as the result of Stalin's wise leadership. Comparison with Germany. Against the backdrop of the mistakes and repressions of German leaders, the image of Stalin as an effective leader seemed attractive and convincing. Reality: mistakes and repressions. 1. Repression of officers. In the late 1930s, tens of thousands of officers were repressed. This led to poor command preparation for Operation Barbarossa. 2. Poor decisions at the beginning of the war. Failed strategy of concentrating troops near the border, underestimating the scale of the German invasion. Inadequate preparation for logistical problems. These mistakes led to massive losses for the Red Army in 1941, millions killed or captured. 3. Political motivation. Many decisions were made based on fear of internal enemies. Casualties among the population and troops were often considered acceptable for the sake of maintaining power. 4. Control and bureaucracy. Strong centralization meant that many operational decisions depended on personal approval. Commanders could not quickly respond to changing situations without sanction from above. Why the myth persists. The USA's victory in the war justified strategic mistakes. Soviet propaganda cemented the image of Stalin as a brilliant leader. In the public consciousness, the simple idea of leader equals victory is convenient and understandable. Result: the myth goes like this: Joseph Stalin always made the right decisions. Reality: Stalin made serious strategic mistakes. His repressions and brutal methods resulted in enormous losses. The USA's victory was achieved thanks to the mobilization of the population, industry, and the efforts of local commanders, not solely to Stalin's genius. Myth 14. The Battle of Stalingrad was won easily. The myth of an easy victory at the Battle of Stalingrad has emerged in popular culture and school textbooks. It often portrays Soviet troops as having won thanks to their numerical superiority and heroism, ignoring the brutal conditions, enormous losses, and tactical errors. In reality, the Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest and most difficult battles in human history, where the myth came from Soviet propaganda during and after the war. The victory at Stalingrad was presented as a triumph of strategic wisdom and the people's heroism. Film and literature works of fiction often simplify events, focusing on isolated episodes of courage rather than the large-scale catastrophe. Comparison with the Western Front. In the popular imagination, the Western War appeared more organized, while the Eastern Front was presented as a heroic, but almost perfect Soviet feat. Reality: extreme conditions. 1. Scale of the battles. Battles lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. The encirclement of the Sixth Army led to protracted street fighting. Streets, houses, and factories became battlefields, reducing the city to ruins. 2. Casualties and cruelty. Soviet losses: approximately 1.1 million killed, wounded, and missing. German losses: over 800,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Conditions: frost, hunger, artillery shelling a daily threat to the life of every soldier. 3. Tactical difficulties: cauldrons and encirclements were frequently used, leading to the complete isolation of units. Commanders made mistakes due to a lack of information, and the chaos of battle. Supply lines were stretched and under constant fire. 4. Conditions for soldier: cold temperatures, down to -30 C. Lack of clothing and food. Illness and fatigue. Constant enemy pressure, and the need to engage in close combat. This battle was far from an easy victory, and required colossal efforts, resources, and human fortitude. Why the myth persists: the propaganda image of the triumph of Stalingrad is convenient for national pride. Popular culture simplifies history by highlighting individual heroes, rather than the scale of the catastrophe. Comparisons with other fronts create the impression of ease, when in reality the fighting was grueling. Conclusion: the myth goes like this: the Battle of Stalingrad was won easily. Reality: the battle was extremely bloody. The conditions and losses were colossal. Victory was achieved through intense effort, strategy, and at enormous human cost. Myth 15. Allied bombing campaigns completely destroyed German industry in a short time. This myth claims that Allied strategic bombing campaigns destroyed German industry almost instantly, and decided the outcome of the war. Popular culture often portrays Allied bombing campaigns as an effective weapon, capable of crushing the enemy. The reality, however, was far more complex. German industry survived, adapted, and often increased production despite the destruction. Where the myth originated: Allied propaganda bombing was presented as a decisive factor to maintain morale at home and among the Allies. Film and literature: films and books emphasized the destruction of cities, creating the impression of an immediate effect. Simplification for a mass audience: the story of complex production chains and technological adaptations does not seem spectacular. Reality: adaptation of German industry. 1. Relocation of production: large factories were destroyed, but Germany actively moved production to underground complexes. Factories for tanks, aircraft, and weapons were built underground or in hidden locations. 2. Large-scale civilian casualties: the main effect of the bombing was the massive destruction of cities and infrastructure. Civilian casualties exceeded the destruction of industry. City residents suffered from hunger, cold, and devastation, but production continued. 3. Resilience to bombing: Germany implemented shift changes at factories, distributed production, and measures to protect facilities. Production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery continued, sometimes higher than before the bombing. Logistics and supplies were a problem, but not a collapse. 4. Limited strategic effects: the destruction of railway junctions and bridges affected supply lines to the front, but not immediately. Some industries, for example, ammunition production, continued to operate at full capacity. Why the myth persists: visual images of devastated cities are striking. Propaganda and later films reinforce the effect. It's convenient to attribute the Allied victory to the instantaneous impact of air power, rather than to a combination of frontline actions and resources. Results: the myth goes like this: Allied bombing campaigns completely destroyed German industry in a short time. Reality: Germany was able to adapt, relocate production, and maintain its industrial potential. The main effect of the bombing was the destruction of cities and civilian casualties. The Allied victory was achieved through a combination of strategic actions, not just air power. Myth 16. The Nazi SS consisted only of fanatics and sadists. In popular culture, the Nazi SS is often portrayed solely as sadists and fanatics who enjoyed cruelty. Films, TV series, and books create an image of completely immoral, evil people. In reality, the situation was more complex. The SS included people with diverse motivations, ideological beliefs, and career goals, not just fanatics. Where the myth came from large-scale crimes, the SS participated in mass murder, genocide, and repression. This justifiably created an image of sadists. Film and fiction oversimplifies motivation by presenting all members as fanatics. Psychological effect: it is easier for society to perceive evil as monolithic, they're all sadists, than to understand the nuances of motivation. Reality: diversity of motivations. 1. Ideological beliefs. Some SS members truly believed in Nazi ideology, the superiority of the Aryan race, and the necessity of genocide. Their actions were cruel, but motivated by ideology. 2. Career and professional goals. Many joined the SS for career advancement, education, and family security. They weren't always fanatics, some simply sought protection and social privileges. 3. Social pressure and fear. Refusal to serve was often punishable by death or imprisonment. Many followed orders out of fear for themselves or their families. 4. Different SS units. Waffen-SS, combat units at the front, where most members were soldiers following orders. Totenkopfverband, guarding concentration camps and participating in mass murder, where the proportion of sadists was higher. Administrative and support units. Bureaucratic work. Logistics, where motivation could be pragmatic. Why the myth persists: it's convenient to perceive evil as monolithic. Movies, games, and books reinforced the stereotype. The simple explanation, all SS are sadists, is easier for a mass audience. Result: the myth goes like this: the Nazi SS consisted only of fanatics and sadists. Reality: the composition was diverse. Fanatics, ideologists, careerists, people under threat of punishment. Large-scale crimes create the impression of a monolith, but the motivations were complex. Fanaticism was one component, not the only characteristic, of all SS members. Myth 17. All Allied armies fought with moral integrity and without crime. The myth of the pure Allies creates the impression that the Allied forces acted exclusively honestly and humanely, in contrast to the cruel Axis. In popular culture, this is often presented as a given. The Allies are heroes, and the Germans and Japanese are villains. In reality, the Allied forces also committed war crimes and atrocities, although these are less often discussed. Where the myth originated: Allied propaganda. During the war, the Allied powers created an image of the morality and humanity of their armies to maintain domestic and foreign support. Fiction. Films and books often depict the war from the perspective of the Allied heroes, leaving crimes out of the picture. Historical selectivity. After the war, the emphasis was placed on the Allied victory and sacrifices, which simplified the moral picture. Reality. Examples of violations. 1. Aerial bombing. The bombing of cities in Germany, Japan, and Italy resulted in massive civilian casualties. For example, the attacks on Dresden and Tokyo caused hundreds of thousands of casualties. 2. Treatment of prisoners of war. There were cases of cruel treatment of German and Japanese prisoners of war. Some allies violated the Geneva Convention, especially in the chaos of the front. 3. Reprisals and executions. Certain units carried out executions and reprisals against suspected collaborators. Local residents in some occupied areas suffered collective punishment. 4. Colonial troops. In Asian and African regions, Allied colonial troops could also use brutal methods to control the population. Propaganda often concealed such actions, focusing on the heroism of the mother country. Why the myth lives on. It's easier to perceive the Allies as heroes. War propaganda emphasizes the moral superiority. History is often told through a national lens, rather than globally and objectively. Results. The myth goes like this: all Allied armies fought with moral integrity and without crime. Reality. The Allies committed war crimes and atrocities, although they were less frequently discussed. Heroism and moral actions existed, but they did not exclude violations. The history of war is more complex than pure allies against evil enemies. Myth 18. Japanese soldiers always fought to the last and never surrendered. Popular culture often portrays Japanese soldiers as fanatics who never surrendered, fighting to the last bullet. Films and video games reinforce the image of self-sacrifice and the unyielding samurai spirit. In reality, the situation was more complex. Many Japanese soldiers surrendered or avoided deadly situations, especially near the end of the war, and the tenacity of most was the result of propaganda and discipline, not natural character. Where the myth originated, Allied propaganda, American and British sources exaggerated the cruelty of Japanese soldiers to justify bloody attacks. In the Pacific theater, film and media films depict isolated instances of fierce resistance as the norm for the entire army. Stereotypes of the samurai spirit, Western culture, has traditionally portrayed Japanese people as fanatical fighters, ready to die, which ignores the real diversity of behavior. Reality. Diversity of behavior. 1. Survival strategy. Many soldiers surrendered to save their lives, especially when the situation was hopeless. Propaganda often forced soldiers to hide or feel ashamed of their surrender. 2. Psychological pressure. Constant ideological indoctrination and the threat of reprisals motivated soldiers to deadly devotion. But off the front, discipline weakened. 3. Large-scale surrender. For example, in the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and other fronts, many Japanese units surrendered or were destroyed without epic resistance. The myth of never surrendering soldiers arose from observing a few exceptional cases that made it into reports and films. 4. Death orders and Yukodo. The Japanese army used death orders, fight to the death, and the practice of Yukodo, suicide for the sake of the army. But this did not reflect the behavior of all soldiers, most of whom were trying to survive. Why the myth persists. Dramatization of individual episodes, desperate attacks, kamikazes, street fighting propaganda, and war reports simplified the picture. Stereotypes about the fanatical Japanese were convenient for justifying the Allies' difficult military actions. Results. The myth goes like this. Japanese soldiers always fought to the last and never surrendered. Reality. The behavior of Japanese soldiers varied. Fanatics, ideologists, ordinary soldiers trying to survive. The myth arose from propaganda, film, and individual cases of heroism. In practice, mass surrender and survival were common, especially towards the end of the war. Myth 19. Holocaust survivors always told the truth about what happened. There's a stereotype in popular culture that the memories and testimonies of Holocaust survivors are completely accurate and flawless. Books, films, and documentaries often use personal stories as an absolute historical fact. In reality, human memory is imperfect, and stress, trauma, and the decades between the events and their descriptions influence the accuracy of recollections. Where the myth came from understanding mass horrors, it's important for audiences to perceive testimonies as living history. It makes the events more real. Documentaries and literature survivor stories are often presented as completely accurate to enhance their emotional impact. Ethical position. Writers and directors try not to question the memories of victims to avoid accusations of revisionism. Reality. The limitations of memory. 1. The effect of trauma. Stressful experiences and violence greatly distort memory. Some events could be mixed up or changed during recollection. 2. The effect of time. Many memories were recorded decades later. The smallest details could be forgotten or recalled inaccurately. The chronology of events sometimes shifts. 3. Psychological mechanisms. Subconscious self-defense. The brain can forget or soften experiences. Survivors can focus on some episodes, forgetting others. 4. Imperfect sources. Some recollections contradict archival documents. Historians use a combination of sources, archives, letters, testimonies, photographs to reconstruct a more accurate picture. Why the myth persists. The emotional power of personal stories makes them perceived as absolute truth. Respect for the victims hinders critical analysis. History of the Holocaust is taught as a moral lesson, which enhances credibility testimonies. Results: the myth goes like this. Holocaust survivors always told the truth about what happened. Reality: memories are often essentially accurate, but details can be distorted. Trauma, time, and psychological processes influence the recall of events. Historical reconstruction requires comparing multiple sources, rather than blindly relying on individual accounts. Myth 20. The Pearl Harbor attack took the US completely by surprise. Popular culture has a perception that the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, took the US completely by surprise and that American forces were completely unprepared. Movies, books, and popular stories create the impression of complete surprise. In reality, the situation was more complex. The US had intelligence and warnings, but they were not properly interpreted or acted upon. Where the myth came from: popular movies, film and television portrayed a surprise attack to enhance dramatic effect. National mythology, portraying the attack as a complete surprise, creates an image of heroic resistance. And the US's rapid rise to war. Propaganda. The notion of complete surprise justified subsequent mass mobilizations and US interventions in the war. Reality. Partial warnings. 1. Intelligence. American services had information about a possible Japanese attack. Intercepts and decryptions of Japanese messages indicated increased Japanese naval activity. 2. Warnings and their disregard. Some officers were aware of the potential threat, but underestimated its scale. Intelligence signals were often considered too general or contradictory. 3. Fleet preparation. Warships were in harbor, but had partial cover. American forces were not completely unprepared. Some air and coastal defense units responded to the attack. 4. Strategic mistakes. Surprise was partial, not absolute. Poor coordination and insufficient preparation for the attack exacerbated the consequences. Why the myth lives on. The dramatic effect of a surprise attack enhances the spectacle of the story. Convenient for national mythology: the image of heroes overcoming a sudden adversity threat. Simplifying events makes them more understandable to a mass audience. Result: the myth goes like this. The Pearl Harbor attack caught the US completely by surprise. Reality: the US had partial warnings and intelligence, but misinterpreted them. The attack was unexpected, but not total. Strategic mistakes and underestimation of the threat exacerbated the consequences. Myth 21. The D-Day invasion was error-free and a complete success the first time. This myth claims that the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were perfectly planned and immediately successful. Popular films and textbooks portray the day as a triumph of strategic mastery, with virtually no casualties. In reality, Operation Overlord was extremely risky, chaotic, and accompanied by heavy losses, and success was achieved through combined efforts and adaptation to mistakes on the ground. Where the myth originated: Allied propaganda. The image of a precise and error-free landing was used to boost public morale. Fiction films and TV series focus on the heroism of individual units, obscuring the chaos and losses. Light historical interpretation. The simple picture of planned landing success is easier to grasp than the complex process of preparation, adaptation, and mistakes. Reality: chaos and casualties. 1. Scale of the operation: over 156,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches: Utah, Utah, Omaha, Gold, and Juneau. Huge quantities of equipment and supplies were delivered simultaneously, creating chaos on the beaches. 2. Mistakes and unexpected circumstances. Not all beachheads were captured immediately. Weather conditions reduced visibility and naval transport. Terrain with minefields, ditches, and fortifications increased casualties. 3. Casualties and difficulties. Hundreds of soldiers were killed, thousands were wounded. Some landings landed on the wrong beaches, leading to disorganization. Communication and coordination between units was often disrupted. 4. Adaptation on the ground. The success of the landing was achieved thanks to the decisions of commanders on the ground the heroism of the soldiers, and the rapid response to unexpected difficulties. The plan was flexible, which allowed them to overcome the enemy's mistakes and resistance. Why the myth persists. It's important to portray the Allies' triumph in the public consciousness. Simplifying history makes it accessible and inspiring. Dramatizing individual episodes obscures the chaos and losses. Results. The myth goes like this. The D-Day invasion was error-free and completely successful the first time. Reality. The operation was chaotic, risky, and costly. Success was achieved through adaptation, heroism, and the on-the-spot decisions of commanders. Not a perfectly planned scenario. The history of D-Day is much more complex than a perfect operation. The history of World War I is far more complex than we've been told. Heroes, villains, victories, and defeats all intertwined with truth, myths, and human stories that don't fit into textbooks. Every myth we've examined today demonstrates how easily history can be distorted, and how important it is to seek the truth ourselves. The world of war isn't black and white. It's full of nuances, mistakes, and unexpected decisions that change the course of history forever.